Chapter 20 of The Expedition of the Donner Party and Its Tragic Fate. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Donna Stewart, Seattle, Washington. The Expedition of the Donner Party and Its Tragic Fate by Eliza P. Donner Houghton. Chapter 20. I returned to Grandma. War rumors at the fort. Lingering hope that my mother might be living. An Indian convoy. The Bruners and their home. The spring of 1848 was at hand when my brother-in-law said to me, "Grandma Brunner wants you to come back to her. And if you would like to go, I'll take you to the fort as soon as the weather changes, and leave you with the people who are getting ready to move north and are willing to take you with them to Sonoma, where Grandma now lives." The storm was not over, but the day was promising when my bundle of clothes was again on the pommel of the saddle, and I was ready to begin my journey. I was so excited that I could hardly get around to say good-bye to those who had gathered to see me off. We returned by the same route that we had followed out on that warm June day, but everything seemed different. The catkins on the willows were forming, and the plain was green with young grass. As we neared the fort, we passed a large camp of fine-looking Indians who, I was told, were the friendly Walla Wallas that came every spring to trade ponies and otter and beaver skins with Captain Sutter for provisions, blankets, beads, gun caps, shot, and powder. A large emigrant wagon stood near the adobe house where my new brother-in-law drew rein. Before dismounting, he reached back, took me by the arm, and carefully supported me as I slid from the horse to the ground. I was so stiff that I could hardly stand, but he led me to the door, where we were welcomed by a good-natured woman, to whom he said, "Well, Mrs. Lennox, you see I brought the little girl. I don't think she'll be much trouble unless she talks you to death." Then he told her that I had, during the ride, asked him more questions than a man 6 times his size could answer. But she laughed and "'lowed" that I couldn't match either of her 3 boys in asking questions, and then informed him that she did not "calculate on making a move till the roads be drier and the weather settled." She promised, however, that I should have good care until I could be handed over to the Bruners. After a few words with her in private, Perry McCoon bade me good-bye and passed out of my life forever. I was now again with emigrants who had crossed the plains in 1846, but who had followed the Fort Hall route and so escaped the misfortunes that befell the Donner Party. Supper over, Mrs. Lennox made me a bed on the floor in the far corner of the room. I must have fallen asleep as soon as my head touched the pillow, for I remember nothing more until I was awakened by voices and saw the candle still burning, and Mrs. Lennox and 2 men and a woman sitting near the table. The man speaking had a shrill voice, and his words were so terrifying that I shook all over. My hair felt as though it were trying to pull itself out by the roots. A cold sweat dampened my clothes. I was afraid to move or to turn my eyes. Listening, I tried to remember how many Indians he was talking about. I knew it must be a great many, for it was such a long word. After they went away and the house was dark, I still seemed to see his excited manner and to hear him say, "Mrs. Lennox, we got to get out of here right away, for I heard tell at the store before I come up that there's bound to be an Injun outbreak. Them savages from Sonora are already on their way up, and they'll kill and scalp every man, woman, and child they can catch. And there's nothing to keep 'em from catching us if we stay at this here little fort any longer." I lay awake a long while. I did not dare call out, because I imagined some of those Indians might have got ahead of the rest and be sneaking up to our house at that very moment. I wondered where I could hide if they should climb through the window, and I felt that Georgia would never know what had become of me if they should kill and scalp me. As soon as Mrs. Lennox stirred in the morning, I ran to her and had a good cry. She threatened all sorts of things for the man that had caused me so much torture, and declared that he believed everything he heard. He did not seem to remember how many 100 miles away Sonora was, nor how many loaded cannon there were at the fort. I felt better satisfied, however, when she told me that she had made up her mind to start for Sonoma the next day. After breakfast, her younger boys wanted to see the Walla Wallas and took me along. A cold breath from the Sierra Nevadas made me look up and shiver. Soon Captains Sutter and Kern passed us, the former on his favorite white horse and the latter on a dark bay. I was delighted to catch a glimpse of those two good friends, but they did not know it. They had been to see the Indian ponies, and before we got to the big gate, they had gone in, and the Walla Wallas were forming a line on both sides of the road between the gate and the front of the store. Only 2 Indians at a time were allowed to enter the building, and as they were slow in making their trades, we had a good chance to see them all. The men, the boys, and most of the women were dressed in fringed buckskin suits, and their hands and faces were painted red, as the Sioux warriors of Fort Laramie painted their cheeks. The Lennox boys took greatest interest in the little fellows with the bows and arrows, but I could not keep my eyes from the young princess, who stood beside her father, the chief. She was all shimmering with beads. They formed flowers on her moccasins, fringed the outer seams of her doeskin trousers and the hem of her tunic, formed a stripe around her armholes and her belt, glittered on a band which held in place the eagle plume in her hair, dangled from her ears and encircled her neck and arms. Yet she did not seem to wear one too many. She looked so winsome and picturesque that I have never forgotten the laughing, pretty picture. We started back over ground where my little sisters and I had wandered the previous spring. The people whom I remembered had since gone to other settlements, and strangers lived in the old huts. I could not help looking in as we passed, for I still felt that Mother might not be dead. She might have come down the mountain alone, and perhaps I could find her. The boys, not knowing why I lagged behind, tried to hurry me along, and finally left me to go home by myself. This not from unkindness, but rather love of teasing, and also oblivion of the vain hope I cherished. Mrs. Lennox let me dry the dishes for her after the noon meal, then sent me to visit the neighbor in the next house, while she should stow her things in the wagon and get ready for the journey. I loved this lady in the next house as soon as she spoke to me, and I was delighted with her baby, who reached out his little arms to have me take him, and raised his head for me to kiss his lips. While he slept, his mother sewed and talked with me. She had known my parents on the plains, and now let me sit at her feet, giving me her workbox that I might look at its bobbins of different colored thread, and the pretty needle book. When I told her that the things looked a little like Mother's, and that sometimes Mother would let me take the tiniest bit of her wax, she gave me permission to take a tiny taste of that which I held in my hand, to see if it was like that which I remembered. Only she, the baby, and I sat down to tea. Yet she said she was glad she had company, for baby's papa was away with Captain Fremont, and she was lonesome. After I learned that she would have to stay until he came back, I was troubled, and told what I had heard in the night. She assured me that those in charge of the fort heard every day all that was going on for miles and miles around, and that if they should learn that fighting Indians were coming, they would take all the white people and the good Indians to the fort, and then shoot the bad ones with the cannon that peeped through its embrasures. The dainty meal and her motherly talk kept me a happy child until I heard the footsteps of the Lennox boys. I knew they were coming for me, and that I should have to sleep in that dark room where I had been so afraid. Quickly slipping from my chair under the table, and hiding behind my new friend's dress skirt, I begged her not to let them know where I was, and please to let me stay with her all night. I listened as she sent the boys back to tell their mother that she would keep me until morning, adding that she would step in and explain matters after she put her baby to bed. Before I went to sleep, she heard me say my prayers and kissed me good night. When I awoke next morning, I was not in her house, but in Mrs. Lennox's wagon on the way to Sonoma. The distance between the fort and Sonoma was only about 80 miles, yet the heavy roads and the frequent showers kept us on the journey more than a week. It was still drizzling when we reached the town, and Mrs. Lennox learned where the Bruners lived. I had been told that they would be looking for me, and I expected to go to them at once.